director, what was your biggest challenge working on the X-Files?
Well, the biggest challenge was creating the directing style for the show, which was really what I did. And it was supposedly, it was called a television series, but it wasn't, it wasn't like any television series. It was, most TV series is like NYPD Blue. They've got 3 stages with all the sets, and maybe they'll go on one or like at one location and for a day or something. This one was, every show was like a new movie. And I mean, every episode obviously was a different location and different casts. And, the most that we were able to put together, that's sort of a regular thing, was Mulder's office and Skinner's office, the FBI stuff. But that never was more, except for certain episodes, was only like a half a day's work. And all the rest of the other, well, they weren't even catching my breath from chasing dogs here.
Time. We're no rush.
Yeah.
Most of the others, by the time we got to the second season, we realized it was too big a show to be done in 8 days, which most 1-hour shows at that time were shot in 8 days. So we actually had 2 crews going, and I had to put together a whole second crew from the second season on. So we really were shooting like 11, 12, 13-day shows. But in the beginning, we wanted it, my concern with the show was I didn't do the pilot. I saw the pilot, and I thought the pilot presented a very good idea of what the show could be. I didn't think it quite got to where it should be. And I told Chris, I said, the challenge with this show is, if you look at these scripts and all these monsters and special effects things and all, if it's not done right, it's going to be really cheesy. It could be really easy to do a show. If you take those stories, worms under the skin of people going up the back of their neck, and if you didn't do all of that, if you didn't do and the acting, we shot in Vancouver, and up till then, the biggest producer, or the most prolific producer up there was, Stephen Cannell, and he was a great guy, and he did a bunch of very successful shows, but they were all very, the acting style was very sort of declamatory and, over the top kind of stuff. And I wanted it to be nuanced and fine-tuned, and and so we had to worry about the style of the acting. We had to worry about everything, the look of the show. The show at the time we did it, nothing on television looked like that show. It was it was like a little movie every week. And so one of the stories that everybody talks about was when there's a painter named Caravaggio. Are you familiar with him? In 1993, when we started the show, Caravaggio actually was kind of forgotten. He was a very bad boy back in the 1600s, and he died very young, and he was kind of forgotten by history. But it turns out that he was the guy who created the look of Western art from that day forward. He influenced the Rembrandt and those people up there, Velasquez in Spain. All of this came from Caravaggio. So I had seen him in an art history class in college, where he was sort of dismissed as one of several painters from the 15th, 16th century, but I just was taken by it. So I took one of his paintings, and if you get it, you'll see what I'm talking about. It's called The Calling of St. Matthew. Okay, you'll find that, you'll see what I'm talking about, because what Caravaggio did, he staged these very dramatic moments. They almost look like stills from movies. And then he accented them with this very, called chiaroscura. It's light and shadow. So there's very dark shadows, black shadows, and shafts of light that would come in and just glance across, the models and all. And so I got that, and I put it on a board, and I brought in my, the cinematographer and, the art director and everybody, the props people, the wardrobe, and directors. And I said, this is what the show's going to look like. We're going to do a show like has never been on television. So it was the look of the show, and then how do you shoot it? You know, I mean, a lot of shows are very simplistic. You know, they shoot wide shot, close up, medium shot, blah blah blah. And I decided we would have this much more fluid camera movements and much more camera work that augments the stories. That, you know, if you keep a scene very tight, you can't see what's around the sides of you, and can be very scary in the right moments. You know, sometimes you want to be big and wide like a movie. You know, we shot some stuff that was huge, so it was kind of putting all that stuff together. That was the challenge, and it was especially difficult the first season, because the first season we used a number of directors who were used to doing more what's the right word, formulaic shows, you know, more like the actual, you know, cop shows or medical shows or whatever those are. And they weren't used to having to have a whole new cast who had to be directed. You know, on a regular show, all the actors, the regulars, you know, think about NYPD Blue, all those actors, I mean, they had maybe a couple of guest stars, but mostly they all knew their characters, you know, pretty much knew when you've got a new cast every year and they're in Vancouver and they're used to have been doing Cannell's stuff, you know, which was very, again, it was great for what it was, but it was a different concept. All of that had to be brought to the bear. And so we ended up in the first season, I would prep them as best I could, and I would do a lot of storyboards, and I would do as much work as we could in terms of rehearsing stuff, and so that hopefully they would go out and deliver, you know, deliver the show we wanted to make. And when you're doing 25 episodes a year or whatever, that's about what we average. You want all the episodes to look like they're in the same show, you know. So it's kind of hard because you're talking about a show that every story is different, with a different cast and different locations and all of that, and different challenges, whether they be big special effects scenes or, you know, flooding a building and people being washed up to the ceiling and all these different things you had to do. It was just too much of a challenge for a lot of those directors. So eventually as we learned how to do it, and we kind of, you know, I did bring in a couple of directors that first season who were actually Jerry Friedman and Billy Graham, and people who had done, not only were they top television directors with like Emmys and, you know, and all that kind of stuff, but they also were feature film directors. So they worked pretty well, but I couldn't get those guys to work 6 episodes a year. They had their big monster projects. So we ended up sort of, you know, first David Nutter was just terrific. You know, I didn't know David. I was introduced to him by the Wongs. The Wongs are, of course, Glenn Morgan and Jim Wong. We used to call them the Wongs. And David was terrific. So I signed him up for everything I could get him for. And then, of course, Rob Bowman and then Kim Manners. So between David, Rob, Kim, and myself, it sort of evolved that we did 80% directed 80% of the shows. You know, we made them all producers, so they couldn't go anywhere and do other shows. They had to be with us, right? And so that was the challenge, and it was hard. And it was also hard because Chris, who is one of the greatest guys, he's such a gentleman and so, you know, so ambitious to do really great work and everything. He hadn't had a lot of experience. He'd only done one series before, which he actually had asked if I could produce it for him, but I wasn't available to do that. We were both working at NBC Productions, and I had another series I was doing. So and that was just a little family show. It was a very kind of simple, you know, sort of a half-hour version of the Brady Bunch or something. And so he had no experience. So he would come up with these story ideas like the nuclear submarine, the Ohio-class nuclear submarine surfaces at the North Pole coming up through the polar ice cap, and Mulder is wrestling with the alien bounty hunter as it starts to submerge, or we're in some gulag and there's 45 horsemen, Russian Cossacks were driving. I mean, he came up with all these, he and, the Wongs had been writers for, let me get rid of this. They had been writers for Cannell. And they did some great shows. They did 21 Jump Street, which starred Johnny Depp, I mean, there was some really good stuff. But they Cannell was famous for being, very strict about production. They didn't like people going over budget and all this kind of, I mean, I know because I did a movie for them. I'm going to just turn off this phone here. Hold on. So the Wongs wrote great scripts that, all of their scripts. I would have taken the one, what was the name of the one up at the North Pole where the research station where that's where the worm goes inside.
Ice.
Yeah, and all that. I mean, but they wrote stuff that was, because of their experience with Cannell, they understood production. Chris and some of the other writers didn't really care. And so they wrote these really difficult, challenging shows that I just did, and we had to keep doing it. I remember at one point I called the head of the studio. This was in the second season, and we had all these huge monster stories with just incredible effects or sequences, people, Mulder running on a top of a train and a train blows up. And I mean, all these things. And I called the studio and I said, listen, this is a television series. This is not a feature film. And you guys, Chris, and I love Chris, and she's great to work with, but he's writing feature films, and you got to do something about this because it's very hard for us to maintain the kind of quality that we're giving you with all of these difficult shows. And his response was, Bob, just keep saying to yourself, I'm working on the best show on television. I'm working on and then Charlie Goldstein, who was the head of television production for Fox, called me up and he said, I've never heard a production guy, head of production, say this to me. He says, I don't know how you're doing this here, but whatever you do, hire as many people as you have to hire, spend as much money as you need to spend, don't miss an air date. So all of a sudden I had the weight of the world on my shoulders. I had no choice. So I used to say even all the way through the second season, I would say they'd send, I gotten as much involved as I could with the scripts and the stories, but I would, I didn't have time to get into the room, and that was in LA and I was in Vancouver with all the crew and and so I used to say it, and it was semi-true that before I could read a new script, I'd have to drink a bottle of wine because I was, I didn't know what was going to happen to me. There was, and I was very stressed out those first couple of years. None of us had ever had been handed this kind of a challenge in television before. And then, like I said, once I got that call from Charlie and he said, spend what you had, I said, we still weren't spending any more money than most of the shows that were on the air at that time. But that's when I decided I'm going to get the second crew. So we would schedule these things very carefully so that, we'd shoot 8 days with the first crew, and then we'd have anywhere from 2, 3, or 4 days with the second crew. I'd have to bicycle David and Jillian from one stage to the other, and switch episodes. This is this, listen to what's episode is. Okay, remember where you are. Okay, and then and then we would use that crew to do all of those intricate insert stuffs, because the show is made up of a lot of very detailed close-up with little weird things that are implanted in people's brain or something, that kind of thing. So once we got all that done, and once I got through 2 years of it, I kind of zenned myself out. I said, okay, we've done some shows we never thought we could do. We've done so many of them, and we've done them, and they're good. Take it easy, Bob. Just relax and just to take a different attitude. So I did. It was good.
You directed the most intricate of the intricate shows. I mean, you were doing all the conspiracy shows each season, it seemed like.
For the most part, yeah. I did all.
That's insane.
The first season, I only had my name on the Erlenmeyer Flask, which was the last episode of the season.
Right.
Wrote that episode. That was the best episode that he had written to date. It was amazing script.
Great episode. And
I got a call. By the way, this is the first season, so we were doing well enough to stay on the air, but it was Friday nights. You never can get a very big audience on television on Friday nights. And Charlie Goldstein called me up. He said, I just read the script you're going to direct. I said, yeah. He says, how are you going to do that in 8 days? I said, I have no idea. He says, hey, I'll give you an extra day. You know what I mean? It was great. And meanwhile, because we weren't a big hit for that first season, we got to do it our way. We did it. I had no phone calls saying, you can't do this, you can't do that, because they weren't paying a lot of attention. And the way it worked out was that Erlenmeyer Flask was such a great show that the word of mouth spread over the summer, and then they did the reruns over the summer of the first season, and everybody went to see him. And we opened up the second season, and Rupert Murdoch was wandering around the hallways going, "It's a hit!" So it was like just this major leap, and then we went to Sunday nights, which really grew the audience. So, but eventually, I got to the point where I'd done enough of them that I knew I was not going to die, And the problem was, and this is why the first season was so difficult, because a lot of those shows, what we used to say was the directors, we bring the directors, most of them came from LA. At that point, there weren't a lot of Canadian directors available, really, most of them were doing movies. But we used to say we'd bring the directors up and send them back in a body bag. That was the way it worked.
Oh, nice.
And I would end up having to reshoot a lot of the material. And it was very hard because I was executive producing. So I would start at 8 a.m. on a location scout for the next episode, but then I'd be shooting it till midnight or to one of the next morning on an episode we were reshooting. It became very difficult, but it sorted itself out. Thank God for the Nutters and Bowman Manners and then some of the James Whitmore II. Was a terrific director. Some of those episodic people really stepped up, but you realize that most episodic people, if they're really good, they book themselves out for the whole year.
Right.
So you can keep getting them back. So that's why we have to, when we've got somebody that could really do the show, that's when we would put them under contract as producers.
So as a director, you mainly dealt with Chris Carter as a writer. I was doing research, and really he was the only writer that your specific episodes were. Did you guys have
No, not true.
There was one I thought
almost true, but not completely true.
Almost true. Okay.
Yeah, I did the second season. Jim and Glenn called me, and they said,
that's right.
We love your directing, and would you direct one of our scripts? And I said, sure. I'd love to, because I love their scripts, and they're great goofy guys. I really like working with them, but they wouldn't tell me what it's about. And one of the things that happened in the first season was there was one episode. There was one episode called Beyond the Sea, and in the scene, it starts with Scully's just gone to dinner with her parents, and the father dies, and the mother, it's at the funeral and everything. And so David Nutter was directing, and he says to me, I know who should play the mother. I said, who? He says, Sheila. Okay. So Sheila and I have had this, before this, a pact, because she'd done a couple of movies that I'd produced because the director wanted her, the casting director wanted her. So we had a rule. If she was going to audition, I couldn't be in the room. And if she got the job, I couldn't be on the set. Okay. So now she does that episode. Everybody loves her. She suddenly becomes Margaret Scully. The fans fell in love. And so Jim and Glenn wouldn't tell me. And they had a show, and it was called One Breath. And it's about Scully had been abducted by aliens and was missing for 3 episodes. That's because Jillian had been pregnant. And finally, and it says they found her and she's near death. And it's a whole bunch of beautiful stuff. It won all these Emmys, visions of near death sequences and all. But one of the key guest actor, at that time, I guess, was Margaret Scully. And I'm directing, and Jim and Glenn knew that I had this pact with Sheila that I would not be on stage when she's acting, and I would, and they wrote this, just that's their little joke. They made me do this. So that's the one. I'll tell you the funny part of that. When the first scene we did, because of the schedule, was a scene where it's with the doctor, Margaret Scully, her other daughter, Scully's sister, and Mulder. And the doctor is telling them that Scully has gone beyond her living will, and it's time they have to pull the plug on her. And I said, okay, great. So we shot a master scene, and I was doing Sheila's close-up. And at the point where the doctor said they got to pull the plug, Sheila did this thing where she kind of went like that, And Sheila is she's a Jewish girl from New York. And so I finished that, her close up, and I said, that's a print. That's a great. I want to do it just one more. And I went over to her. I said, let's just do one without the oy vey. She says, what oy vey? There was no oy vey. There was an oy vey. Don't want the oy vey. But other than that, it was always Chris wrote the script. Yeah.
Right. So you were mainly dealing with the conspiracy focused episodes like Erlenmeyer Flask. How did you guys have a process when you two were prepping episodes?
A process? Yeah.
Yeah. Like when
I
you're
always have a process. I mean, that's my main job as an executive producer is prepping, because you're prepping not only the director, but the actors, the guest actors that you're using and everything. And so I spend, while one episode is shooting for 8 days, during those 8 days, I'm prepping the next episode so that director goes in, and that's why I did all these storyboards. I did everything so that I would pretty much hopefully get what we wanted. And so, yeah, it's a process. I mean, we start off, we get the script, which was, never on time, but we got the script. We'd all the departments would read it, everybody, casting, this and that, and we'd have a concept meeting, like the first day of, if you got the script in time, maybe the first day of production, of pre-production, first day of prep. And we'd go around the table, and everybody, we'd go through the script, every, page by page, and every department, whoever, if anybody had questions or concerns or were not sure about something and all that, then that was their chance to ask, and usually because of the nature of, being split up between Vancouver and LA, a lot of the time, Chris and the writers were on video, so, and we were all up in Vancouver. Chris usually came up for prep on the shows he wrote. The writer, whoever wrote the episode, would come up for the prep of it. So we do the concept meetings, everybody go busy doing all of their stuff, finding locations, designing sets. We're free, casting. So then we'd have our casting sessions. It's crazy. It's just so, many different details. And the one thing I've known for years is that, it's very, very hard to produce and direct a film or a television show. And if it's going to be really, really good, every single detail has to be really, really good. You can't overlook any detail. And I'm a very detailed person, and I would drive everybody crazy. I was so obsessive, and I'd be wandering every department. I'd make sure everybody was up to speed and all that kind of stuff. And then once you've pretty much gotten everything ready to go, you have one day we call it a tech scout, where now we've already picked all the locations. We know where we're going to shoot it, and the sets are pretty, if not built, they're getting built. And we'd go on a tech scout, and the director, who usually was either me, Rob, Kim, or David, would tell the crew the key. There's all the key, the key people, like the electricians, the camera guys, the grip, set deck, blah blah blah, what the scene was, how we're going to shoot it, where, and everybody could figure out all the production angle part problems, where you put the circus, and where and then the last day we do a cast read through, and then a production meeting, where you go through in detail, and then you pray to God that nothing goes wrong, and something always goes wrong. So just one of the rules.
You're making me miss being on set, because my set's so different, but I remember all those steps putting into an episode.
I love being on the set, and I really love directing. I mean, for me, that's the fun part of it. Producing, it's especially when in my position, I was the top of the food chain there. So I had a lot of responsibility. I mean, the only ones that I really had to report to were of course, I worked with Chris, but we were partners pretty much, but the head of the studio, or the head, or some network people. But like I said, they pretty much left us alone after the first season, during the first season, and then we were a hit, so they didn't want to mess with us. So that was that part of it was fairly easy. But like a friend of mine, I like hiring people who want my job. And there are a number of people who have worked for me as production assistants, or line producers, or production managers, or whatever, assistant directors, who later became executive producers. And one of them is a guy named Ed Milkovich, who's done a lot of the shows I had. And he's now, I don't think he's doing it anymore, but he became a full-blown exec producer. And he said to me, producing a TV show is like getting up every morning and being chased by coyotes. So, hey, Sheila,
Yeah.
come here and say hello. These are
Love it. I love that. That's how I feel every day at work.
That's Lauren and Carly.
Oh, hello.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm okay.
Welcome to our retrospective.
When you were shooting the X-Files in season 1, could you have imagined the success and continued success that the show would have back in those early days?
Yes.
Really?
Not only I never forget it. I was in an office up in Vancouver with Chris and David, Chris Carter and David Duchovny. And I told him I thought the show was going to be a big hit. And the reason, because I've done a lot of shows, and fortunately I've done shows that have been hits. I mean, Life Goes On was one of my favorite shows. I mean, I just couldn't, I only did the last 2 years of it, but I've done a number of shows with Emmys and, Golden Globes and all that kind of stuff. But I've always felt there's 3 elements. You need to have the material, of course, without a script. And in this case, we didn't have much. This was even before we started production, it was just the very beginning. But we knew the stories. I had already seen enough of the story outlines and had participated in enough that I knew they were really fascinating stuff. The cast has to work, and we already knew from the pilot that David and Jillian had amazing, charisma, and they were just so great together. And then the other element is how it's mounted and directed, and I knew what I could do with it. So I said to him, you guys, this could be a huge hit, really, as long as we don't make it cheesy. So yes, I honestly did know. It was surprising. It's the first time I'm trying to think. I don't think I've ever had that experience where I felt so certain, but it was really, I thought it was there.
you transitioned on, I know you had written before, but you had transitioned from directing to writing with Demons in season 4, which I watched today. What was that transition like, being on the other side of the camera and working with Kim Manners?
Well, for one thing, first of all, I made a living as a writer when I was very young. I started in production. I was a location manager, but then I really wanted to direct and produce. And so I started writing spec scripts. In those days, there were a lot of independent film companies. And I sold 12 scripts over a period of 2 years. I mean, you know, I made my living writing.
Right.
But then once I started really getting successful as producing television shows and movies and that kind of stuff, I would write usually one episode on each show I produce, because writing an episode on a show that you're going to have to produce and maybe direct is like a doctor operating on himself. You know everything that could go wrong and all that, you know. And when I wrote Demons, I was out of my mind, because first of all, I was still producing this very difficult show. So I went up to Whistler, and I locked myself in a condo up in Whistler for a week and just wrote it, got it done. And it was agony, because I just knew some of those sequences I wrote were going to be hard to pull off, but they wouldn't be, because I knew I could do it, but I didn't know I could do it when I was writing it. Do you know what I'm saying? It was a challenge.
Beautifully filmed. I mean, I know beautifully written and beautifully filmed, but those scenes, the flashbacks with Mulder and his sister, and with like Dean Ellsworth, and it wasn't Rebecca Tolan as a young woman. It was her character as a young woman.
Yeah.
It was so cool.
Yeah, it was good. It was Kim directed that.
Kim, yeah.
Yeah, he did a great job.
Beautifully filmed.
Love Kim.
Do you have a favorite memory from working on the X-Files?
One favorite memory? I know, I have so many. There's so many. I mean, it was the most amazing, experience I've ever had in my life. I mean, no one will ever have the kind of chance to do that like I did, because it was just, no one else has done it. They've tried to do a few knockoffs of it that really are obviously just knockoffs and things like that. But the challenge of doing so many different kinds of things, and it was, I mean, you say that I always directed the big, sort of the challenging ones and everything else, but there, I'll never forget the time we did the one with the nuclear submarine coming up through the polar ice cap. Okay, and everybody was saying, okay, so let's do it in the parking lot up at up in the mountains here. And I said, yeah, but what if it rains and there's no snow? I mean, you can't. This has to be on the stage. So I got I rented a separate stage, because we already had 3 of our own stages. I rented a separate stage. I brought in refrigeration units. We got it down to like 18 degrees in there. We brought in about 50 tons of ice and snow, built this full-sized conning tower of an Ohio-class submarine. It was huge, and it was all on hydraulics, so that when Mulder fought the alien, when it was a bounty hunter, they would be able to, descend and everything else. And I remember walking on the stage, and Rob Bowman was directing that episode. And he says to me, God, Bob, thank you so much. This is so great. I said, yeah, well, screw yourself. I want to direct it. You know what I mean? I got to stand next to an elephant. We had that one episode where the aliens were turning the animals invisible, and they were like, we had an invisible rampaging elephant in that one, but we had to have a real elephant, to shoot the stuff where we saw him. I had to stand next to a real elephant. I mean, it was. And by the way, the 2 handlers who brought him up, it came from Georgia or someplace, because they didn't have an elephant for some reason in Canada. I could tell when I went down to the stage to meet the elephant that these 2 guys were scared to death of this thing. And I'm going, maybe I shouldn't be here. You know what I mean? But I think the most important thing for me the best memories I have are all the people, all the people. They were just so talented, so hardworking, and David and Jillian were great. I mean, there were times when we were all of a sudden this big international hit, and it's a little hard to keep your sensibilities kind of right, but they did, and I really enjoyed working with him. David is such a funny guy. He's just got the greatest sense of humor. He's so smart, and when you can make him laugh, you really feel like you've done something. And Jillian, God, she didn't know what she was doing. This movie started. She didn't even know she had to remember her lines. She didn't know. I finally, after the first 2 weeks, because I'm all out, like I said, I'm always prepping the next director. And in those early days, I was dying and trying to get all these people to do what needed to be done. But I'd keep, so I'd get to the set once in a while when I'd go to the set, if there was a problem, I'd be there right away. But otherwise, I'd stop by there a couple times a day, whatever. If it was on the sound stage, that would be great. Even on locations, I'd go out there. What was I going to say about that? That was okay. I lost my train of thought right
You were
there.
saying Jillian didn't remember her lines.
Oh yeah, yes. So after the first couple of weeks, I kept looking. We were going over long hours. It was crazy. So I said, "What's going on? Why this is like that particular day wasn't that hard a day. Why did you go 4 hours?" And they're going, "Well, we got no problem with Jillian. She doesn't remember her lines." And I said, "Okay." So I took one day and I told everybody I'm going to be on the set from the call time to wrap time. I'm not going to leave. I want a stopwatch so I can time things and stuff. And I sat there, and what would happen, Jillian would go up like every third line, and then she'd laugh, and then, okay, take 27. You know what I mean? And so I sat her down and I said, "Look, I don't know if you've noticed, but when you go up on your line and you're in a take in double digits and you laugh, did you notice that nobody else is laughing?" Because you're keeping us here hours and hours longer, and we're not going to make it. We're going to die if we keep doing this.
Right.
So I said, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll give you, if you like, I will get you a tape recorder and you can record your lines, and so how to can learn them that way. Or if you'd like, I will hire a dialogue coach who will work with you so that you can get through them. But one way or the other, you really need to know your lines when you get there. From that day on, she was perfect. Letter perfect. It was great. She was great. And the thing about Jillian that was so good, she was a naturally talented actor. But I mean, acting is a skill. You have to hone the skill and learn how to do it. And she actually did use the X-Files to learn how to act. I mean, that's where she honed her amazing talents, And then that's why she won the SAG Awards and the Emmys. And she's, I saw her in London, same trip when I saw Patti LuPone Company, and she's in a show called All About Eve, and she's just turned into this amazing actor and a really good person. So, I mean, I can't say everybody that worked on that show was a great person, but if they weren't, they didn't work there anymore. I mean, it was simple as that. I'm in charge here, right? And I had to make changes, as any producer has to in the first year. But we ended up with just the greatest crew, the greatest cast and staff and all of that stuff. So it was just and then we won, 3 Golden Globes, and we got all these Emmys, and so it was very fulfilling. It was great. Well, like I say, I mean, the Billy Graham I mentioned, he was a really top television director and a feature film director. He's one of my best friends. I'd done a bunch of movies with him, and he came in and did a couple of the X-Files as a favor, really. But he used to say, he talked kind of like this. He said, filmmaking is a collaborative medium. Otherwise, they'd only order one lunch. So it's the people that and we had two crews. Think about that. I had two. We had at one point during our peak, I mean, for the last 3 seasons, or even maybe the second season, I had 450 people working for me every day.
I can't.
And honest to God, I knew what every one of them was doing. I did. I'm such a
for it.
nosy person.
Yeah, this is something that we ask everyone that we have had the pleasure and opportunity of catching up with. So if you could say something to the fans of the X-Files over the last 27 years, what would it be?
Well, I do appreciate so much to all those people, and and it's, you find out, as years go by and you meet more and more people, the show, really did have a big effect on people. Sometimes I kind of felt like, get a life, you know what I mean? It's only a television show. But on the other hand, I really appreciated that. And I appreciated their, I feel good about having done something that really was meaningful and, really meaningful for a lot of people. It just amazes me how many times people will say, oh my God, that was my favorite show. I never, and now it's starting all over again, because we've got a whole group of young people that are just discovering the show, college people. And I'm still, I had a little silly little sort of funny sci-fi movie. It was called Alien Trespass that I did independently a few years ago. It was basically a 1957 sci-fi movie, and we made it to look like it was actually made in 1957. And I had the actors, Eric McCormack was the lead, and Robert Patrick was in it, and just Dan. Anyway, some really great actors and a great crew, a lot of them from the X-Files. And when we went on the road with it, because I had a friend who was, he had wanted to make this movie forever, and he had the money to do it. So he was my partner on it. And we would go to all the Comic-Cons on the publicity tour. And, I still couldn't believe it. I would go on, I'd have Eric with me, Cormac, or, some other one of the actors, and we would get 3,000 people in an auditorium for these. And it was all because of X-Files. And half of them were young people, which that's the part I love. I mean, it's got a life beyond, far beyond I would have ever thought. But a friend of mine well, it was, I guess now several months ago, because it was before the pandemic really hit. It was about a year ago, I guess. She asked me if I could meet her 20-year-old son. I said, sure, because this is a huge X-Files fan. He's 20 years old, so stuff like that's really great. And, I've had a great career. I've done a lot of really good shows, movies and everything else. And it's just very fulfilling to know that I did that show for 5 years.